They threw away my photos, said they needed the closet space for the baby. That was the sentence that ended 40 years of my life, spoken by my own daughter, while she folded newborn clothes that still had the price tags hanging from them. She said it gently, as if she were offering comfort, as if the destruction of a life's work could be softened by the word need. I am 81 now, living alone in a small apartment that smells faintly of Fixer and coffee. And sometimes, when I open the wardrobe, I still expect to see the metal boxes where I kept my negatives, the long rows of envelopes marked in my handwriting: 1972, Brooklyn; 1978, Winter Light; 1991, Self-Portraits in Motion. For decades, those boxes followed me from apartment to apartment, from marriage to widowhood, from the city to the suburbs and back again. They were not just images. They were evidence that I had once seen the world in my own way. My daughter, Lila, never liked the smell of the chemicals. When she was a child, she used to complain that the darkroom made the whole house reek of vinegar, and I would tell her that art always has a smell, that truth leaves residue. She would roll her eyes, already impatient with my metaphors, already longing for something tidier. When she and her husband lost their house in the fire 2 years ago, I was the one who offered them mine. It wasn't large, but it was paid off, and I thought it would be a good thing to have life in it again. The laughter of a baby, the sound of family. I moved my cameras into the guest room, stacked the boxes neatly, and told myself that I would digitize the old prints soon, maybe even mount a small exhibition before my hands grew too unsteady to frame the photos myself. The first few weeks were almost tender. Lila was soft-spoken, fragile from pregnancy, her husband over-helpful, and I felt useful again, as though I were part of a necessary story. Then one morning, I came home from the grocery store to find a mountain of pastel boxes in the hallway. Baby things, bassinets, toys, a stroller that looked more complicated than the car I once owned. Lila was standing by the guest room door with a clipboard, pointing as the movers carried my storage boxes toward the garage. I remember the exact way she smiled, brittle, apologetic. "We just need to clear a little space, Mom. The baby will need a nursery, and you said yourself those photos are heavy." I told her to wait, that those boxes weren't just paper, but she was already turning toward the kitchen, calling something about safety hazards and dust. By the time I followed her outside, the boxes were gone. Not stacked in the garage, not labeled for storage. Gone. I looked into the back of the truck, saw a few lids half closed over fragments of my past, and I understood without needing to ask. They weren't being moved. They were being thrown away. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I simply asked where they were taking them, and Lila said, "The city will recycle it." "Don't worry, Mom. It's better this way." "You shouldn't keep everything." "Better this way." The words slid into me like a dull knife, slow but final. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house hummed with baby monitors and soft music from some prenatal playlist. I went into what used to be my studio and found it stripped bare, the walls painted a sterile shade of white. There was no trace that anything had ever been created there. My enlarger was gone, my drying line gone, even the stains on the counter scrubbed clean. It was as if my daughter had erased me with bleach. I sat on the floor for a long time, thinking about every image I'd taken. The man in Harlem reading his son's report card under a streetlight. The woman in the subway wearing a paper crown on her lunch break. The snowfall on the pier in '76 that made the air look like salt. They were all gone now, dissolved into landfill or burned in some anonymous pile of household debris. 40 years of looking at the world and asking it to look back. I didn't tell Lila the next morning that she had destroyed something valuable. I didn't tell her that a few of those prints had sold in small galleries decades ago, that a collector once offered to buy the whole Winter Light series for the equivalent of a year's salary. She wouldn't have cared. To her, those photographs were a symptom of nostalgia, not achievement. She said I should focus on being a grandmother, that the past was too heavy to carry. She said the baby would bring new memories, as if new memories could replace old truths. I smiled and nodded, because that's what mothers do. We nod through the betrayals. We forgive before we've even had time to grieve. But something inside me had shifted. When you spend a lifetime seeing others clearly, strangers on buses, lovers in doorways, the way light touches the backs of hands, you think you'll recognize cruelty when it comes. You don't. It comes wearing a familiar face, holding a child, saying it's for your own good. I began to notice how Lila looked at me when I took out my camera to photograph the baby. Her smile tightened, her posture changed. "Oh, Mom, let's just use the phone," she'd say. "It's easier." Easier meant cheaper, faster, disposable. The opposite of what I had built my life upon. Once I tried to explain to her that a photograph isn't just an image, it's a negotiation between time and attention. She laughed and said, "You make everything sound so serious." But it was serious. It was my way of being alive. I started walking at night when the house was quiet, taking the old camera I'd managed to save. Just one, a small Leica I'd kept in a drawer under my clothes. I would walk down to the river, take pictures of the streetlights reflected in the water, of my own shadow stretching across the pavement. It was the only proof I still existed as myself. But even that felt dangerous, like disobedience. Once when I came back late, I heard her whispering to her husband in the kitchen. "She gets confused sometimes," she said. "She still talks about those photos like they were famous. Maybe we should think about assisted living soon." Confused. That's the word they use when they want to take away your truth. I wanted to storm in and shout that I wasn't confused, that I knew exactly what I'd lost and who had taken it. But I didn't. Instead, I went upstairs and lay in the dark, counting the seconds between the baby's soft cries and the sound of Lila's footsteps. I realized then that I was no longer living in my own house. I was a tolerated ghost. The next morning, she brought me tea and said she hoped I wasn't upset about the old stuff. I told her I wasn't. That was the first lie. The second was when I said I was proud of her for being practical. She kissed my cheek, and for a moment I almost believed the warmth meant love. But love doesn't erase you to make room for someone else. Love remembers. Love archives. When I finally moved out 6 months later, she helped pack my things, careful, efficient. I asked about the photos again, just once, and she sighed. "Mom, please don't start that again. They were just pictures." I smiled, because by then I had learned that the only way to survive certain kinds of cruelty is to pretend you didn't notice. But I noticed everything. The silence where my name should have been. The emptiness where my work once stood. The way the house gleamed as if it had swallowed me whole. They threw away my photos, but what they really discarded was the version of me that refused to stay small. I've been building her back ever since, in quiet rooms, under gentle light, frame by frame. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels unremarkable until you realize later it was the hinge your whole life swung on. The sky was a flat, indifferent gray, and I was wearing the same cardigan I always wore when I wanted to appear calm. My son arrived early, earlier than usual, carrying a leather folder and 2 cups of coffee. "Mom," he said, in that careful voice people use when they've practiced their lines, "I thought we could finally take care of the paperwork. It'll only take a few minutes." I was still half asleep, my hair unbrushed, the television humming softly with some morning news I wasn't listening to. I told him I hadn't decided yet. He smiled, that gentle, rehearsed smile of his, and set the coffee on the table. "You don't need to decide, Mom. You just need to sign what's already right." There's a tone grown children sometimes use with their parents, a strange mixture of affection and condescension, like you're an old pet they're fond of, but can't quite trust not to ruin the carpet. That's how he sounded. Behind him stood Dana, his wife, holding her phone, pretending to scroll but glancing up every few seconds, as if to ensure the scene was proceeding as planned. The documents were already spread out, neat stacks of white paper held down by a silver pen. I remember how my son opened the folder, his fingers steady, his voice patient. "It's really just a transfer of title. You'll still live here as long as you like. It's just that I'll handle the maintenance, the taxes, all the practicalities. You shouldn't be bothered with all that now." I wanted to ask what he meant by now, but I didn't. My mouth felt dry, and the smell of coffee, once comforting, seemed suddenly invasive, heavy with something that wasn't warmth. He pushed the pen toward me like a waiter sliding a check across the table. The gesture was so familiar it almost made me laugh. But I didn't. I looked at the line where my name was printed. Full name, maiden name included. The name I had used when I signed the loan with my husband 40 years ago. It looked strange to me now, out of place, like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to me. I asked him if he'd read everything carefully, if he understood what these papers meant. "Of course," he said quickly. "I've been talking with the lawyer. It's standard. We just need your signature to make everything official." The lawyer. He said it as if invoking a priest, as if legality were morality. I should have insisted on reading every page, but instead, I just flipped through them, not seeing words, only feeling weight. The pages were thick, expensively thick, and the font so small it blurred into pattern. He must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because he reached out and placed his hand over mine. "Mom," he said softly, "trust me. You know I'd never do anything to hurt you." The phrase hit me like a stone. I'd heard it once before, long ago from my husband, when we refinanced the house to pay for Michael's university. Back then, too, it had sounded like love. Later, I learned it was more like pleading. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that what I was feeling, the strange pressure in my chest, the slight tremor in my fingers, was just fear of change. People like to say that age brings wisdom, but what it really brings is fatigue, and fatigue makes you compliant. So I nodded, and he smiled, and that smile was all it took. He placed the document before me, and I signed, my handwriting smaller than usual, as if even my name were retreating from the act. Dana took a photo. "For the records," she said. And then she smiled too, the smile of someone watching a door close quietly behind them. When they left, they hugged me, both of them at once, a double embrace that felt more like containment than comfort. "You did the right thing," Michael said. "You'll see how much easier everything gets now." The sound of their car pulling away was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. I sat at the table for a long time afterward, staring at the cup of coffee he'd brought me. It had gone cold, and a thin film had formed on the surface, a dull skin that seemed to thicken the longer I watched it. I should have called someone, a lawyer, a friend, anyone. But who do you call when the betrayal is so intimate it feels like your own fault? I went to the sink, poured out the coffee, and watched it swirl down the drain, disappearing without protest. That's when I saw it. A second copy of the deed he'd left on the counter, a blank version, perhaps an oversight. My name was printed at the top, but in the owner's section below, only his was filled in. Sole proprietor. I read those words over and over until they lost meaning, until they were just sounds, cruel and dry. I sat on the kitchen floor, the paper trembling in my hands, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because of shock, but because of recognition. He hadn't tricked me, not really. He had simply learned from me. I had raised him to be capable, persuasive, confident. I had taught him to never hesitate when pursuing what he wanted. I had just never thought what he wanted might one day be mine. That night, when the wind picked up and the old house moaned in its wooden bones, I felt it grieving with me. Every creak sounded like a whisper of warning I hadn't heeded. I couldn't sleep. I went to the window and watched the neighbor's porch light flicker, a single warm spot in a street that suddenly looked unfamiliar. The deed lay open on the table, the ink still fresh, glinting under the lamp. My name was there, but it was only a ghost, a signature divorced from its body. I thought about calling Michael, telling him I'd changed my mind, that I wanted to revisit the agreement. But I could already imagine his voice, tired, patient, slightly patronizing, saying, "Mom, don't stress about it. Everything's fine." The next morning, I heard his car pull into the driveway again. He came in without knocking, as if the house already knew it belonged to him. "Just dropping off some documents," he said, avoiding my eyes. Everything went through perfectly. Went through. The words landed like a verdict. He left before I could reply, leaving behind a faint scent of his cologne and the metallic echo of finality. I sat there for a long time, unable to move, feeling the weight of silence settle around me. The house felt smaller, the air heavier. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick with judgment. I realized then that this was not just about property or papers. It was about erasure. With one stroke of a pen, I had made myself expendable. I thought of my husband again, how proud he'd been when we made the last payment on the mortgage, how he'd opened a bottle of cheap champagne and poured it into mismatched glasses because we own this now, sweetheart. We. He was gone, but that we had remained in the bricks, the windows, the creaking steps. Now, even that had been rewritten. I tried to tell myself it was only a formality, that nothing would really change. But deep down, I knew better. Formalities are how cruelty dresses up for dinner. That night, I dreamed of the house crumbling inward, walls folding like paper, the lilacs turning to dust. When I woke, my pillow was damp. The room looked the same, but I could feel it. Something essential had shifted. The house no longer belonged to me, and in a way, neither did I. The next day, Mrs. Ellison knocked on my door, holding a basket of apples from her yard. She was always bringing something, pie, jam, news. She looked at me closely, the way old women look when they already know the truth but want to hear you say it. "You signed, didn't you?" she asked. I didn't answer, just nodded. She sighed, set the basket down and said, "Well, my dear, the ink's dry, but the story's not." Then she left me there, standing in my kitchen, holding the fruit of someone else's labor, realizing I had done the same, given everything I'd grown to people who would never taste it right. That was the moment I understood the betrayal wasn't in the signature. It was in the lie I'd told myself, that love could protect you from greed, that family could never be the hand that pushes you out of your own home. When I arrived in the city that morning, I felt like a ghost drifting through a place that remembered me better than my own family did. The train station had changed, but not entirely. The same echoing announcements, the same stale coffee smell, the same blur of hurried faces. I walked slowly, not because of my knees, but because I needed to remind myself that I still occupied space, that I was not yet erased. My bag was heavy with the few things I had brought: clothes, toiletries, my camera wrapped in a scarf, and the envelope of surviving negatives, my secret treasure. I had not told Lila how long I'd be gone. I suspected she would not notice until she needed me for something practical. Outside the station, rain drizzled on the pavement, turning the taxis into yellow smudges of light. I boarded a bus without checking the route, just letting the city decide for me. When it stopped near a park, I stepped off, drawn by the sight of trees bending under the wind. The park was nearly empty, except for a man feeding pigeons and a mother pushing a stroller. I sat on a wet bench, opened my camera, and took my first photo in months, a blurred shot of the pigeons scattering. It wasn't art, it was proof. Proof that my hands still knew how to find the shutter, that I could still translate what I felt into light. I stayed there for an hour, taking pictures of raindrops clinging to the bench, of my reflection in a puddle, of nothing and everything. When my fingers went numb, I went to a small cafe across the street, the kind of place that still used chipped mugs and smelled like burnt toast. I ordered tea and sat near the window. For the first time in years, no one was waiting for me to finish. I was invisible, but in a good way. Invisible by choice. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, asked if I was visiting. I told her I used to live here a long time ago, and she said, "You should see the new art center. They reopened it after renovation." The word art felt like an old song I hadn't heard in years. I asked for the address and walked there after finishing my tea. The building was modern and sterile, all glass and white walls, but the exhibit was called Women Who Framed the City. I entered half expecting disappointment, and then I froze. On the far wall hung one of my photographs, no doubt about it. The curve of the bridge at dusk, the two teenagers sitting on the railing, their silhouettes outlined by the last light of day. I felt dizzy. I walked closer, heart pounding. My name wasn't on the label. It said, "Unknown Photographer, circa 1976, Brooklyn Series." My fingers trembled as I traced the edge of the frame, the faint marks on the lower right corner, where I had once signed my initials. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was both a miracle and a theft. Someone had found one of my lost prints, rescued it from oblivion, but it stood there nameless, stripped of its mother. A woman approached me, mid-30s, professional-looking, wearing a museum badge that said, "Curator, Grace Winters." She noticed my interest and smiled politely. "Beautiful, isn't it? That piece came from a private estate donation. We couldn't identify the artist." I said, quietly but clearly, "You just did." She frowned, uncertain, and I repeated it. "It's mine." Her expression shifted from politeness to surprise. "Yours? You mean you took it?" I nodded. "I took it in 1976, Brooklyn Bridge." Those two boys were brothers. I met them while working on a city youth program. I still have the negatives. She stared at me for a long time before asking my name, and when I told her, recognition flickered. Wait, Mary Doyle? You had an exhibition in 1983, didn't you? Light Between People? I smiled faintly. You have a good memory. She said she'd studied my work in an archival class, that my name was mentioned in feminist photography circles, that my series was considered formative. I felt like I was hearing about a stranger. She asked what had happened to my portfolio, and I told her the truth. My daughter had thrown it all away. Grace looked stunned. All of it? She asked. I nodded. Except what I managed to hide. She said quietly, Do you know what this could be worth now? Vintage photojournalism from that era, especially by women, is being rediscovered. You could have been part of this exhibition officially. I told her it was too late. She disagreed. It's never too late for the record to be corrected. She gave me her card and asked if I still lived in the city. I lied and said yes. When I left the gallery, my head was spinning. The air smelled like wet concrete and possibility. I sat on a bench outside and pressed her card between my palms as if it might dissolve. For the first time since the day my photos were thrown away, I felt something close to purpose. But purpose, I've learned, is dangerous when you live under someone else's roof. When I returned home 3 days later, Leela was waiting in the kitchen. Her expression was a blend of irritation and relief. You could have called, she said. We didn't know where you were. I wanted to say, you didn't ask. Instead, I told her I needed time to think, that I had visited the old neighborhood. She said, That's fine, but please don't wander off like that again. You worry us. The us meant her husband, the baby, the people whose lives I cluttered. That night, I hid Grace's business card inside a book, afraid even of my own daughter discovering it. Over the following days, the distance between us grew quieter but sharper. She stopped asking me to join meals. I stopped offering to help. I spent my time sitting by the window, photographing the light shifting across the walls, documenting the hours she didn't see me. One morning, I overheard her on the phone telling a friend, Mom's getting worse. She keeps taking pictures of shadows and calling them art. I wanted to tell her that shadows are all that's left when someone takes your light, but I didn't. I began going to the library every afternoon under the pretense of borrowing books. In reality, I met Grace once a week in the cafe next door. She asked if I still had any negatives, and when I brought the envelope, she handled it like a sacred object. She promised to help me restore and digitize them, to reintroduce my name into the record. I almost didn't believe her. She said, You know, there's a small grant for recovering lost women photographers. We could apply. I laughed softly and told her my daughter would think it absurd. Grace frowned. You can't let her define you. But that's what family does. They define you until you stop existing outside their sentences. The more I met with Grace, the more I remembered who I had been. The woman who once traveled alone through cities, carrying cameras heavier than her suitcase, who slept on floors and woke before dawn for the right light, who wasn't afraid of being poor or unseen because she had a vision that no one could take. Now, even that vision had to be hidden, like contraband. One evening, when I returned home later than usual, Lila asked where I had been. I told her I had gone for a walk. She looked suspicious and asked if I was seeing someone. I almost laughed. Seeing someone. As if there could be romance at 81. I said, Yes, myself. She didn't find it funny. After that, she started keeping closer track of me, asking where I was going, what I was doing, suggesting I might forget things. I realized she was preparing a story, one where I was no longer competent. That frightened me more than anything. I began taking small precautions, keeping copies of documents, notes of every meeting with Grace, a record of what I still owned. The quiet escalation was not loud, not cruel in the way people imagine family cruelty to be. It was soft, civilized, performed through concern. "Mom, maybe we should get you a medical evaluation. Mom, you shouldn't carry that camera. It's heavy. Mom, I'll handle your finances now. It'll be easier." Each phrase wrapped in care, each one another lock on the cage. And I let her, because it was easier to surrender small things while protecting the one thing she couldn't see, the resurrection of my name. Every night, after they went to bed, I sat by the window, the baby monitor's faint hum in the background, and I wrote notes to myself. You are not losing your mind. You are losing your audience. The city outside shimmered with reflected lights. I took a photo of my own reflection against the glass, layered with the streetlights beyond. When I printed it later at Grace's studio, the image looked like a double exposure. Me and the world, half transparent, half present. She said it might be her favorite. I told her it was the truest one I'd ever taken. The first escalation of what had begun as grief was now something else entirely. A quiet rebellion. I didn't raise my voice or argue anymore. I simply began to reclaim the evidence of my existence one photograph at a time. But I could feel the walls of my daughter's house tightening. Every kindness now felt like surveillance, every gesture like a test. I knew that soon something would break. I just didn't yet know which of us it would be. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, like the slow change in light before dawn, when you can't tell what hour it is, but you know something is turning. Grace called one afternoon to tell me that the small grant she'd mentioned had been approved. She sounded excited, almost breathless, saying that my negatives would be cataloged and restored as part of a program on Forgotten Women of American Photography. I listened in stunned silence while she explained the process, the exhibitions, the press materials that might follow. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated even, but instead, there was a strange hollowness in my chest, as though the victory came too late for the person I used to be. Still, I thanked her, and when she asked if I could bring whatever remaining works I had, I promised to come by the studio the next day. Hanging up, I realized I was smiling, for the first time in months. Not the careful smile I gave Lila to reassure her, but something looser, something alive. That evening, during dinner, Lila asked if I would watch the baby the next day, because she had errands to run. I told her I couldn't, that I had an appointment. She frowned, irritated. "What kind of appointment?" I told her vaguely. "An old friend from the art community wants to see some of my work." She laughed, quick and dismissive. "Mom, please don't get sucked into one of those nostalgia things again. Those people just want to feel charitable." I didn't reply. Her husband looked uncomfortable and changed the subject, but I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. It was the first time I had said no to her in years, and the word felt foreign in my mouth, almost dangerous. The next morning, I dressed carefully, in a navy coat and the old silk scarf that still smelled faintly of darkroom chemicals. I took the envelope of negatives and the small folder of letters I had kept from galleries decades ago, some yellowed, some still crisp, all proof that I had once mattered. On the way to Grace's studio, I stopped at a flower stall and bought a single white tulip. I didn't know why. Perhaps to mark the occasion, perhaps to remind myself that beauty didn't require permission. Grace greeted me with that open, radiant energy of hers. Her sleeves rolled up, her workspace cluttered with prints, scanners, and a faint hum of music from an old radio. She poured us both coffee and handled the negatives like something sacred. "You have no idea what this means," she said. "These aren't just photos. They're history. You documented a version of America that's disappearing." Her words washed over me with both warmth and pain. I had waited decades to hear them, but hearing them now, in my 80s, felt almost cruel, like a compliment delivered too late for the life that might have been built from it. She began scanning the negatives, and one by one, the images appeared on her computer screen. The boys on the bridge, the woman reading by the laundromat window, the cab driver asleep at a red light, my own reflection in a rain puddle. The detail stunned me. Each photograph seemed to breathe again, colors deepened by time, imperfections turned into texture. I felt tears rising, but I kept my composure. Grace looked at me and said, "You have to let people see these again. They deserve to be seen." I wanted to say, "I do too," but the words caught in my throat. On the way back home, I stopped by a bookstore cafe I used to visit decades ago. The barista was new, of course, but the smell was the same, a mixture of dust and cinnamon. I sat with my coffee, staring out the window at people passing, and realized how much of my life had been spent observing others live theirs. It wasn't bitterness I felt, but a kind of gentle regret. I could still recall the first time I picked up a camera, the weight of it, the quiet power it offered, a way to frame chaos into something coherent, to make sense of the unbearable. Somewhere along the line, that instinct had been trained out of me by the daily logistics of motherhood, widowhood, survival. The art of seeing had been replaced by the art of enduring. When I returned home, the house felt smaller, the walls thinner. Lila was in the nursery, singing softly to the baby. I stood in the doorway watching her, remembering when I used to sing to her in the same way, thinking that love was a language you could pass down like a melody. She turned and smiled, unaware that my heart had traveled 1,000 miles from her in the span of a single afternoon. "Mom, the baby fell asleep in my arms today," she whispered proudly. I nodded, forcing a smile, and went to my room. I knew that if I told her about the grant, she would diminish it, turn it into a cute anecdote about her eccentric mother. And so I said nothing. Instead, I took out my old camera and loaded a roll of film, an action so habitual once but almost foreign now. I began photographing the details of my room, the creases in the curtains, the imprint my cup left on the nightstand, the way light slipped under the door. It was a secret act of reclamation. That week, I started walking every morning before they woke, camera in hand, capturing the city as it stretched into daylight. Construction workers smoking before their shift, a woman feeding stray cats near the bus stop, the glimmer of condensation on parked cars. Each frame felt like breathing. Grace called every few days with updates, her enthusiasm like oxygen. "You're going to have a section in the exhibition," she said once. "We're attributing your rediscovered works under your full name. There's even talk of a retrospective next year." I listened, both thrilled and terrified. The thought of my name on a wall again, after being erased for so long, was intoxicating. But I knew what it would mean at home. Lila didn't tolerate anything that shifted the hierarchy she'd built, where she was the center and I was the shadow orbiting around her. The first confrontation came sooner than I expected. One evening, She found the tulip pressed in my notebook and asked where it came from. I told her I'd been seeing an old colleague from the art world. She frowned. Is this about those photos again? Her tone had that careful patience people use with children or the elderly. Mom, you really shouldn't get your hopes up. The past is the past. I told her gently that sometimes the past isn't finished with us yet. Her expression hardened. You're not making any sense. I just don't want you to be disappointed. I wanted to tell her that disappointment had been my daily companion since the day she'd thrown away my life's work, but I said nothing. I realized then that argument was pointless. My daughter was not cruel in the obvious way. She was cruel in the way people are when they believe they're right. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain tapping the window. I thought of Grace's studio, of the photographs glowing on the screen, of how the images seemed to whisper that I was still here, that I had not vanished. I decided I would attend the opening, even if it meant lying to my daughter. I wrote a note and tucked it into my wallet. If anything happens to me, my work is with Grace Winters at the Downtown Art Center. It belongs to me. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Because by now, I understood that erasure doesn't always come in one swift act. Sometimes it happens in stages, through silence, through permission, through the soft tyranny of concern. The next morning, I found Lila at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone while the baby played on a mat nearby. She looked up and said, "You've been restless lately. Maybe we should talk about assisted housing, just in case something happens." Her voice was honeyed, careful. I felt something inside me finally harden into resolve. I told her I'd think about it, but what I meant was that I had already made my decision. I would leave. Not in anger or despair, but in defiance of vanishing. I would go where my name still mattered, where my images still breathed. That afternoon, I met Grace at the studio to deliver a few more negatives. She handed me a proof sheet, dozens of my photographs restored and cataloged under my name. "You see?" she said softly. "You never disappeared. You were just waiting to be found again." I looked at the rows of images and felt a strange calm. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was recognition. For the first time in years, I could see myself clearly, not through the reflection of my daughter's pity or the haze of age, but through the lens I had carried my whole life. The midpoint of my story was not triumph or revenge. It was a quiet reawakening, a realization that the person I had been was still alive somewhere beneath the layers of silence and dust. As I left the studio, twilight fell over the city, the streets wet and shining. I took out my camera and photographed the reflection of the sky in a puddle, the same sky that had once hung over Brooklyn in 1976. The image was imperfect, slightly tilted, but for the first time, I didn't correct it. Some truths don't need straightening. It began with a phone call I wasn't meant to overhear, the kind of hushed conversation people have when they're building a story, not telling the truth. Lila was standing at the kitchen window with her back to me, the baby balanced on her hip, saying to someone, her voice quiet, competent, almost sweet, that her mother had become fixated on old photographs and was showing signs of cognitive decline, and that they were considering options, which was the same phrase insurance people use when they're about to deny you what you paid for. I stood there in the doorway long enough to hear the word guardianship and the name of a lawyer, and then I stepped back, not out of fear, but because I understood that evidence sometimes requires distance, and I needed to see the shape of the trap without rattling it. That afternoon, while she napped with the baby and the house breathed that shallow, performed domestic peace, I went to the library and typed my own name into the computer, half as a joke, half as a dare, and found something that made the room tilt. A small online listing from a regional auction house featuring a vintage gelatin silver print attributed to unknown 1970s urban bridge at dusk, with a reserve price that would have paid my bills for a year and a thumbnail image that was unmistakably mine. The same boys leaning over twilight, the same scuffed railing, the same faint scratch I'd left with my wedding ring when I framed the shot too fast. I printed the listing, tucked it into my coat, and walked to Grace's studio, with the sensation that my past was resurfacing in fragments like a wrecked ship rising through silt. Grace didn't say much at first. She read the listing twice, then pulled out her phone and called someone at the museum. Her tone clipped and focused, and by the time she hung up, she had a plan, and I had a trembling in my hands that wasn't age. We would prepare a statement asserting authorship. She would draft a provenance timeline against the very practical calendar of my life. I would sign affidavits. She would speak to the auction house, and together we would begin the tedious work of proving that a woman who had been erased was not imaginary. It sounded exhausting and delicious, like a meal you think you can't finish until you taste it. That evening, flushed with the heat of action, I did what I knew I shouldn't. I told Lila that an exhibition was including my work under my name, that a grant had been awarded, that an auction listing was being challenged, and I watched her face rearrange itself into the careful mask of approval people wear when their first instinct is to control, not celebrate. She said that was lovely, and that we should approach it responsibly, which in her dialect meant she wanted to be the gatekeeper for any phone calls, to review contracts for safety, to ensure no one took advantage of me. I thanked her and went to my room and wrote on an index card the thing I needed to see in my own handwriting. If protection requires disappearance, it is not protection. The pressure increased as if someone had turned a dial. 2 days later, a glossy envelope arrived, addressed to me from a law firm with a name that sounded like a door closing, and inside was a letter on heavy paper introducing Mr. Sorensen as counsel to my daughter and son-in-law, expressing concern for my well-being, inviting me to consent to a limited financial conservatorship to streamline decisions in my best interest, and suggesting that any rights associated with household photographs be clarified within the family to avoid future misuse. I read it 3 times, the way you read an autopsy report, and then I laughed, a small, sharp laugh that startled even me, because the phrasing was so clean it squeaked, as if the ink had been filtered through a colander of plausible deniability. I placed the letter beside the auction printout and understood that erasure had discovered stationery. The next morning, a message pinged on my phone from a number I didn't recognize, a reporter from a local features desk who had seen the museum's press advisory draft, Grace is doing, and wanted to profile the rediscovery of a neighborhood photographer, and I said yes before fear could answer for me. The interview took place in the cafe near the library, where I used to sit with books I could not afford, and the young woman asked good questions with nervous hands. What did it feel like to be found again? What did I want readers to know about women's work that goes missing? Did I think my daughter meant harm? And I answered in long, careful sentences that contained more mercy than memory, because I have learned that truth without compassion curdles into spectacle. When the piece ran online 2 days later, with a black and white portrait Grace had taken of me, my hair wild, my eyes steady. The comments surprised me. Men and women, my granddaughter's age, writing that they had grandmothers whose stories were boxed in garages, daughters who had been taught to tidy their mothers into silence, artists who had stopped calling themselves artists the day someone affectionate called their work a hobby. I felt seen by strangers in a way I had not been seen by my blood in years, and it was both a sweetness and a sting. That was the same afternoon the appraisal surfaced like a shark's fin. Grace forwarded me an email from an independent expert who had reviewed the list of series I'd described and, with careful caveats, estimated that the destroyed work, if intact and authenticated, would have exceeded $400,000 in aggregate, not counting future resale or institutional placement. Reading that number was not like winning money. It was like opening a door and finding the person you used to be waiting on the other side with a bag in her hand and a look that said, "Too late and right on time." I didn't show Lila the appraisal. I did, however, leave a copy of the reporter's article on the kitchen counter, not as a provocation, but as an invitation to engage with who I was becoming again. And in the evening, I found it in the recycling, along with a grocery flyer, a page ripped down the middle where my face had been, which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of conversation was possible in that house. The next pressure point arrived in shoes rather than paper. I had just returned from Grace's studio when the doorbell rang, and there stood a woman in a beautifully cut coat, holding a leather folder and a smile engineered for hard landings. She introduced herself as a senior care consultant retained by my daughter to help the family plan thoughtfully. And behind her hovered Mr. Sorensen, the legal pen who had found his legs. He called me Mrs. Doyle with a solicitous tilt and asked if we could talk somewhere quiet. I led them to the dining room because performance belongs on a stage, and I sat at the end of the table and let them explain the tender mechanics of my own undoing, how stress can accelerate cognitive decline, how public attention can be overwhelming for seniors, how financial predators target women my age, how a temporary guardianship would be a loving shield, how signing these preliminary documents would allow my daughter to protect my assets, including any revenue from exhibitions or sales, from misuse. I asked whether misuse included the original use by the person who created the work, and Mr. Sorensen, who had never worked in a darkroom and never coaxed an image from a tray with a patient, stubborn hand, told me he understood the emotions involved and that families sometimes struggle with boundaries when late-life reputations emerge. I said I would consider their proposal if they would sign a single sheet acknowledging that the destruction of my archives had been executed without my consent and to my financial detriment. And the consultant's smile cracked like a plate. And Mr. Sorensen said such matters were complex and perhaps best left unstated while we focused on care. I told him that language only ever becomes complex when someone is trying to hide a simple injury. And then I stood, and though my knees protested, my voice did not. I told the consultant she could leave the brochures and take the assumption, and I told Mr. Sorensen that any further contact should be directed to the museum's legal office. And as they hesitated, I walked them to the door the way you walk polite burglars back across the threshold of what they had mistaken for their house. From that day, the air inside the home changed temperature. Lila moved with the studied calm of someone whose story was being threatened, and she began to harvest allies as neatly as she once harvested decor links. Neighbors who worried, a pediatrician who thought my stress might affect the baby, a cousin who texted to ask if I'd considered scaling down responsibilities. In the same breath, invitations appeared that tried to reabsorb my narrative into hers. A brunch where I would be introduced as the inspiration. A family photo session where I would stand between two generations like a decorative spine. An offer to co-author a blog post about mother-daughter creativity that would have been a eulogy disguised as content. I declined with sentences so gentle you could nap on them, and each refusal hardened the edge in her voice, until one evening she said quite calmly, over the sound of the dishwasher, that if I insisted on going public with painful family matters, she would have no choice but to protect our privacy, which I understood to mean lawyer again, and maybe a doctor, and maybe a paper trail that described me in soft medical adjectives that closed doors. It was then that Grace suggested we meet, not just at her studio, but at the museum, where an archivist showed me a thin folder with my name on it. Clippings, a catalog, a printout of the appraisal email, and I felt a sensation I can only call weight returning to the body. Institutions are imperfect creatures, but they know how to house a name, and seeing mine nested in their drawers gave me the courage to do the next dangerous thing. I called my grandson directly. Kieran answered on the second ring with that breathless relief that tells you your voice was a rope in a storm. He said he had read the article and that it sounded exactly like me, that he remembered the way I showed him how to see light in steam when he was 6, that he didn't believe for a second that I was confused, that he was sorry about the boxes because he had watched them go and thought they were being stored, not erased. I closed my eyes and listened to his apology land on the floor between us like a small, clean truth. And I told him I loved him, and that none of this required him to choose sides, only to see clearly, which is both the hardest and only thing. At the end of the call, he asked if he could send me something, and 2 days later, a plain envelope arrived with a photocopy of a picture that used to be on my old refrigerator. Kieran, at 5, holding a cardboard camera we'd made, his tongue between his teeth with the seriousness of play, and in the margin he'd written, "Keep aiming." The second escalation did not crash. It pressed, it accumulated, it tested the seams of my patience until even silence had a sound. The museum sent an official inquiry to the auction house, and, after a dance of emails with language so prim you could put it on a piano, the lot was withdrawn pending resolution, which meant my photograph was saved from being sold without my name, and also meant that the faceless donor who had supplied it would likely learn that the anonymous is not the same as the owner. A week later, the reporter followed up for a longer piece, this time with an audio recorder and kinder eyes. And the story ran with a headline that included the phrase, "making space for baby" in quotation marks that did not blink. And somewhere in the comments, someone wrote that throwing away a woman's work is a kind of domestic arson. And I thought of the fire that had once burned Lila's house and wondered whether we were all just trying to rebuild on ash. That was the morning Lila arrived at my door, not with anger, but with softness so thick it clogged the air. She said she had read the article and that she was hurt, that she had never meant to destroy anything precious, that she had been overwhelmed and pregnant and scared, and that the boxes looked like the past asking for rent she couldn't afford. I listened and believed parts of her, because motherhood is a room with no doors, and fear makes poor archivists of us all. But when she asked if I would help her fix the narrative by issuing a small statement about miscommunication, I saw the seam between remorse and management, and I told her I would forgive her actions without erasing them and would speak with her privately, but not publicly, to varnish the truth. She cried then, quiet but sincere, and in that moment I hated the word victory, because all it meant was two women in a hallway carrying too much history. Still, even tenderness can be tactical. Days later, I received another letter from Mr. Sorensen proposing a family rights agreement that would assign to Lila joint control over reproductions and derivatives. And I sat at the table with my pen and circled each euphemism like a weed I would not allow in my garden. I sent the letter to the museum's council with a note that read simply, "Please respond firmly," and they did, in paragraphs that felt like floorboards under my feet. In the middle of this, as if the past wanted to test the present further, Grace discovered that a small gallery had scheduled a group show using one of my images printed from a low-resolution scan scraped from an old blog post, crediting me on the wall but asking no permission and offering no fee. It was meant as homage, the gallerist said, and I could almost hear the smile. But homage without consent is just theft with flowers, so we asked them to take it down, and when they balked, we asked louder. And when they asked whether I really wanted to alienate young supporters, I remembered the day my daughter had carried my boxes to the curb and said I shouldn't keep everything, and I told the gallerist that boundaries are not fences around love. They are paths leading to real doors. The image came down that afternoon. At home, however, the atmosphere grew more brittle. Lila began to speak of me in the third person when she was on the phone, as if I had already stepped into a past tense she preferred. And once, when I returned later than expected from the museum, she held my arm too gently and asked if I knew what day it was. And I told her I knew exactly what day it was, because the light had the same tired gold as 1978. And she looked at me the way people look at artists when the poetry in our answers frightens them into calling a doctor. I started sleeping with my shoes near the bed and my negatives in a satchel by the door, not because I planned to run in the night, but because precaution feels like courage when the narrative tightens. I made copies of everything, IDs, grant letters, the appraisal, and stashed them at Grace's, and on the back of a grocery list, I scribbled a will as plain as bread. The work is mine. The story is mine. The remainder is mercy. The night before the museum's formal announcement, Lila knocked and asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table where she had once done homework while I graded contact sheets, and she said she feared I was choosing strangers over family. I told her that strangers had offered me the dignity of my name and a chair to sit in, and that family had offered a soft box with a lid. She said she wanted to protect her child from drama, and I said that children learn to breathe under the truth or choke on its absence. She said I was being cruel, and I said I had been kind for so long that the first solid sentence sounded like an alarm. We were quiet after that, the kind of quiet that happens between two cliffs, and then she reached for my hand and held it, and I let her, and neither of us pretended it solved anything. The baby stirred in the next room, that small air saw of infant sleep, and I thought of how many women have taught their daughters to be smaller and called it safety. In the morning, the museum posted a stark, beautiful image from the Winter Light series with my name in a simple font that did not apologize, and I stood in my doorway and stared at it on my phone until the screen dimmed. Within an hour, my inbox held invitations from a university panel, a bookstore reading, a podcast about memory, and in the same hour, my phone lit up with a final text from Mr. Sorensen requesting a meeting to avoid escalation, which was a word I smiled at because we were already standing in it up to our knees. The second escalation had done its job. The past had returned not as a ghost, but as a witness. The present had revealed its appetite for control, and I had acquired a spine made of paper, affidavits, letters, proofs, names that could hold me upright for what I knew had to come next. The part of the story where a woman stops asking to be believed and begins to act as if belief were the air she breathes. The morning of the opening came cold and clear, a thin winter sunlight cutting across the windows like an old blade that still knew how to draw blood. I had barely slept. My body felt like glass, brittle, transparent, holding something too luminous to contain. The museum's driver arrived at 9. Grace had insisted on sending a car, saying she wanted me calm and safe. I sat in the back seat clutching my camera, not to take pictures but as a kind of talisman, a reminder that I still held the instrument that had once shaped the world to my eyes. When we arrived, I saw my name printed on the banner above the entrance. Mary Doyle, the light that stayed. I stood there for a long time, reading it again and again until it stopped being a miracle and became a fact. People walked past, taking photos of the sign, and I wondered if any of them knew how much ash it took to spell those letters. Inside, the museum smelled of varnish and electricity. My images lined the white walls like old friends waiting in silence. I could barely recognize them. Restored, enlarged. They had a presence I had forgotten was possible. The boys on the bridge looked eternal now, not two kids who probably became men and forgot that day, but symbols of something larger, the dignity of being seen without being asked to perform. I stood before them, hands trembling, and whispered, "You made it, my loves." Grace appeared beside me, eyes bright, saying that journalists and curators were in the next room, that the mayor's wife might come later. She looked at me like a proud daughter, and the thought almost undid me. The press began to arrive, voices rising like warm static. I had done a dozen small interviews already, but this felt different, final, like stepping into the photograph instead of standing behind it. A young man from a major newspaper asked if my family would attend, and I said quietly, "My family is here," and gestured to the walls. He laughed, not understanding, but it didn't matter. I was no longer speaking in a language built for their comprehension. I spoke for myself. Then I saw Lila. She stood near the doorway, pale and too elegant for the occasion, holding the baby in one arm and her phone in the other, her husband close behind her. I hadn't invited them. For a moment I thought she had come to make peace, and my heart stuttered with something foolish and old, that animal hope that still lives in mothers long after reason dies. But then I noticed she wasn't looking at me. She was scanning the room, assessing, calculating. Her husband approached first, all polite smiles, saying they were so proud that they wanted to be part of the moment. The words felt rehearsed. Lila joined us, shifting the baby to her other hip, and said softly, "Mom, you should have told me about the exhibit. We could have helped manage things." The word manage made me step back. Grace sensed the temperature change and excused herself, murmuring something about press coordination. Lila's voice lowered. "There are people asking questions about the destroyed photos. It's making us look terrible. Couldn't you just clarify that it was a misunderstanding?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw not malice but fear. The fear of a narrative she couldn't control. The fear that love might no longer look like obedience. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I said. "It was an erasure." She sighed, eyes glistening, a practiced sadness. "Mom, please, I never meant—" "I know," I said. "You never meant. But you did." For a moment, we just stood there, two women holding the wreckage of inheritance between us. Then she whispered, "You don't have to humiliate us." I almost laughed. "You did that yourselves," I said, and turned toward the wall where my name hung. That was when she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document, the same cream paper I had seen before. "We just need your signature," she said quickly. "It's only to make sure your rights are protected that the money—" "The money?" I interrupted. "You threw away $400,000, and now you want to protect it." Her husband murmured something about stress, about how public life can be overwhelming, but his voice faded under the sound of my own pulse. "You don't understand," I said quietly. "I am not overwhelmed. I am awake." People were beginning to glance in our direction. Lila lowered her voice again, pleading now. "Mom, please don't make a scene." And something inside me, the old politeness, the trained instinct to keep the peace, snapped like a string that had been pulled too long. "No," I said, louder than I meant to. "You made the scene when you threw my life into the garbage." The words hung in the air like glass dust. I saw her flinch. The baby stirred, sensing the tension. Grace appeared again, eyes alert, and gently guided us to a quieter corner. "Maybe you all need a moment," she said firmly. Lila started crying, the kind of tears that blur everything except the self, and I realized she wasn't crying for what she had done, but for how it now looked. Grace put a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You don't owe them silence." It was the permission I hadn't known I was still waiting for. When the time came for the speech, the director introduced me with words I barely heard. My ears filled with the low hum of memory, the sound of the enlarger fan, the click of film advancing, the rustle of paper drying in the darkroom. When I stepped up to the microphone, the crowd blurred into light. I didn't have notes. I hadn't needed them for decades. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady, "for giving a name back to what was never lost, only ignored." A small laugh moved through the room. These photographs were made by a woman who believed that ordinary people are worth looking at, that every wrinkle, every shadow, every hesitation of the hand contains a story. For years, those stories lived in boxes. Then one day, someone decided to make space. For new life, they said. And I learned how easily women's work can be mistaken for clutter. A murmur spread through the audience. I caught Lila's face in the crowd. Frozen, unreadable. "But," I continued, "what they didn't know is that light leaves residue. You can throw away the paper, but not the seeing. It stays, stubborn as breath." Applause began softly, then built, and for a moment, the sound filled the emptiness that had lived in my chest since the day those boxes disappeared. After the speech, journalists swarmed, questions layered over compliments, flashes bursting like artificial suns. Grace handled most of it, steering me gently, but then a reporter asked if my daughter had ever apologized. I paused. "She didn't need to," I said. "I learned to forgive without waiting for permission." It was the truest thing I'd said all day. The reporter smiled, not knowing that forgiveness can be both sword and shield. When the crowd thinned, Lila approached again, quieter now. "I can't believe you said that," she whispered. "You've ruined us." "No," I said. "I've freed myself." I touched her arm, lightly, not as comfort, but as benediction. "You wanted to protect me from the world," I said. "But I am the world." She turned away then, holding the baby close, her shoulders shaking. Not from sobs, but from something more complex. the tremor that comes when the story you built collapses under its own weight. Later, in the small private room the museum had prepared, Grace poured me a glass of champagne. "You did it," she said. "It's yours again." I nodded, but what I felt wasn't triumph. It was peace, deep and strange. The kind that comes when you've spent your life trying to be understood and finally realize you no longer need to explain. I walked back into the gallery alone. The lights had dimmed slightly. My photographs shimmered with the quiet authority of things that have survived their own destruction. I stood before the bridge photo again, the one that had begun all of this, and saw, faintly, in the reflection on the glass, my daughter leaving through the exit, the stroller wheels catching for a moment on the threshold before she pushed through. It was not a dramatic exit. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet departure that felt like an ending written in lowercase. As the museum emptied, I took out my camera and, for the first time in years, turned the lens toward myself. Not a smiling portrait, not a vanity shot, just my face in the glass, layered over the boys on the bridge, my past and present occupying the same light. I clicked the shutter. The sound was so small, so final, it felt like a heartbeat. That photograph would be the last I ever took in that house of white walls. The next morning, I packed my things, leaving only a note on the kitchen table. "Do not tidy this." I left the key beneath it. Then I walked to Grace's car waiting outside, carrying only my camera and one framed print. The bridge, of course, because it had carried me across more than one abyss. That was my climax, not because I fought or shouted or won, but because I acted. For the first time in decades, I moved without asking if the motion was acceptable. I left the narrative my daughter had built and stepped into my own. When the door closed behind me, I felt no grief, only gravity. Sometimes reclamation doesn't roar, it exhales. Sometimes the revolution is simply the sound of a woman's footsteps heading in the opposite direction. I live by the sea now. The walls here are thin, the air salted, and every morning the light moves across the floor like water, remembering where it once belonged. I rent the upstairs of a weathered house painted pale blue, owned by a retired teacher who leaves flowers on the windowsill each week without a note. My darkroom is a makeshift corner in the kitchen, red bulb hanging from a nail, trays lined up beside the sink, the smell of fixer threading through the curtains. I tell myself it isn't permanent, but permanence was always a trick I never believed in. What matters is that it's mine. No one tells me to put the camera away or to quiet my voice or to make space. The silence here is generous. It allows me to fill it at my own pace. Some evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the tide roll back, thinking of how much I used to fear emptiness, mistaking it for loneliness when in truth it was room. Room for breath, room for memory, room for self. The museum keeps in touch. Grace calls once a week with updates. A traveling exhibit in Boston, a feature in a journal, a young student writing her thesis on the reclamation of women's archives. She says my photographs are being taught now, that my name has become part of a syllabus. I tell her I'm glad, though glad is too small a word for the layered ache that comes when something you created before you were broken begins to live its own life in the world. Sometimes she sends printed articles, and I lay them on the table and stare at the bylines, thinking of how the same world that erased me now writes about me as if I were a discovery. I don't resent it. There's a strange mercy in the delay of recognition. It comes when you no longer need it to survive, when you can accept it as a mirror rather than a rescue. Lila hasn't called. The silence between us has its own weather, cold but clear. A month after I left, she sent a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. Her as a child, standing in the backyard with a makeshift crown of daisies I had woven for her, sunlight flaring across half her face. On the back, she had written, "I didn't understand what I was throwing away." Nothing else. No signature, no apology, just that line. I placed it on the wall above my desk, not for nostalgia, but as evidence that even regret can learn to speak in complete sentences. Sometimes I look at it and feel sorrow. Sometimes I feel nothing at all. Both are fine. Healing, I've learned, doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes it's just the quiet refusal to keep bleeding for someone who never noticed the wound. My days have their small rituals. I walk to the market in the morning, take photographs of strangers without them knowing, just hands reaching for fruit, faces turning toward sunlight, gestures that vanish in a second but prove that life never stops posing for whoever still bothers to see. I keep the prints in a box labeled later. Not for exhibitions, not for sales, just for proof that I didn't stop. In the afternoons, I teach a small photography class at the community center. My students are mostly women between 60 and 80, each of them carrying a history someone once told them was trivial. We meet every Thursday, and I begin each class with the same sentence. What you see matters, even if no one ever buys it. They laugh, thinking it's encouragement, but for me, it's scripture. They bring me their pictures of kitchens, gardens, hospital rooms, old friends, and I tell them where the light is hiding, where the truth trembles just beneath the blur. One of them, a widow named Carla, said last week, "You talk about light as if it's alive." I smiled and told her, "It is. It always was. You just have to stay long enough to see it come back." At night, when the tide pulls high, I hear the sea tapping against the rocks like a shutter, closing and opening again. I develop film by that rhythm, the red glow wrapping the room in a pulse that feels almost human. Sometimes I think of the boxes that are gone and imagine them dissolving into earth, their paper fibers feeding roots somewhere. Maybe nothing is truly destroyed. Maybe it all just changes form until someone else is ready to look. There's a strange comfort in that thought. I've stopped counting what was lost and started measuring what returned. One room, one voice, one photograph at a time. Last week, a young woman from the museum came to visit, a graduate intern working on the archive catalog. She asked if she could record me talking about my process. I agreed, though part of me dreaded hearing my own voice played back. We sat in the kitchen with the smell of chemicals and tea between us. She was shy, careful with her questions, as if afraid to touch something sacred. At the end, she asked what I would say to women whose work was dismissed or destroyed. I thought for a long time before answering. "Don't wait to be seen," I said finally. "See yourself first. That's the only archive that never burns." She looked at me as if I'd handed her something fragile, and I realized then that every story of survival is just a bridge. Somebody has to cross it after you. The evenings here end quietly. I read. I listen to the wind. I sometimes write small notes to no one, lines that sound like letters but have no address. One of them says, "There's no justice, only continuation." Another, "Love is not proof of goodness. Memory is." These sentences sit in a notebook I keep beside the bed, my private gospel. When I wake in the early hours and the house is still, I look at the faint outline of the camera on the table and think of all the years I tried to make myself small enough to fit into someone else's frame. Never again. The frame is mine now, and the world fits inside it just fine. Once in a while, I dream of the bridge from that old photograph. The boys leaning into the wind, the sky gold with dusk. In the dream, they turn toward me and wave, and I wave back, and the light between us holds steady, unbroken. I wake before they fade, the sea whispering beyond the window, the smell of salt and silver mingling like an old promise kept at last. And I think, not sadly, but with a quiet certainty, that I've crossed every bridge I needed to cross. What remains is just light. Light that stayed.